Greetings, APUSH students. This is Chapter 27, Empire and Expansion, 1890 to 1909. This is also the start of APUSH Period 7, and you'll see that there's a little bit of overlap between Period 6, but that's because this historical period in AP US history deals with America's expansion abroad and its increasing involvement in international issues as America really grows into becoming a world power. So it does overlap a little bit with Period 6, but Period 6, as you know, was a little bit more about the urbanization and industrialization within the country. So this one is going to talk about America's moves to become an empire. America is going to expand its borders beyond the continental US. We're going to go to war with Spain, acquire territories like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So we're going to look at motivations for imperialism, subsequent actions during this time under the presidencies of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. So let us get started. The push for overseas expansion for the United States and the possible acquisition of imperial territories was due to a lot of different factors. I want to go over a few right now. So as America grows, this increasing nationalism is pushing people to advocate for America to become a larger player in world affairs and possibly a competitor with other nations. Up until this point, you remember that the combination of George Washington's farewell address and the Monroe Doctrine, along with focusing on internal issues like expansion within the continent, allowed America to be kind of isolated from the rest of the world. And then you have a civil war, which basically resolved the issue of slavery and unified the country a little bit more on the same, relative economic trajectory. So remember that America is industrializing both in the production of industrial manufactured goods and in food production. This means that American efficiency and increased production is causing many people to look overseas for markets for these products because they're making more than, Americans need. So now also bring in the yellow press and sensationalist journalism that is advocating for some of these ideas. They're going to play a part, especially in going to war with Spain. With the frontier being closed by the 1890s, many historians see this push for expansion overseas as just another extension of Manifest Destiny. Since America now spanned the entire continent, the idea was now that it was time to kind of take on the world. So those are a couple factors. Now let's add in religious and racial considerations. The publication of Our Country by Josiah Strong was written to promote missionary activity among Protestant churches, so there's this renewed push to bring Christianity to other parts of the world. And you remember how social Darwinism was applied to wealthy industrialists versus poor people. Well, this is also applied to the strength of countries and also the strength of races. So it's implied that the strongest country is the one with the greatest military and the most territory. And social Darwinism is inherently tied to ideas about race. So when you apply social Darwinist theory to race theory, the white race was seen as superior and should help elevate others by introducing them to their civilization. So remember, this is also part of a larger trend of imperialism going on in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where European countries are gaining huge amounts of territory in Africa and Asia. So America wants to get involved in that as well. The importance of a strong navy is reinforced by a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And navies at this time ran on coal. This is an important logistical point to keep in mind because that meant that in order to have a navy that could go around the world, you had to have refueling stations at different ports in order to refuel those ships. How are you going to get those ports? You have to gain territory or good relations with the country or establish a military base. So all these factors together help us understand why Americans started to look for overseas expansion and imperial acquisitions. The big event in this chapter is going to be the war with Spain. Most Americans don't even know that we went to war with Spain, but this is kind of the crux of American imperial expansion in the early 1900s. Prior to the war with Spain, there were a number of acquisitions the United States had made that expanded its amount of territory overseas. We've already talked about the purchase of Alaska in 1867, so one of the events I want to talk about here is the acquisition of Hawaii. Hawaii was a monarchy that had a way station to resupply shippers, sailors, and whalers that were in the Pacific Ocean. Missionaries arrived there in the early 1820s, and over time, Hawaii became the center of a lot of sugar production. Some of the land in Hawaii was owned by white planters and had been purchased from the monarchy of Hawaii. The McKinley Tariff of 1890 raised barriers against Hawaiian sugar because Hawaii was a foreign country. So white planters who had economic interests in Hawaii tried to renew this push to annex Hawaii as a U.S. territory. The Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani, pictured here, resisted these efforts. So in 1893, white planters, with the open assistance of the U.S. military, made a coup and toppled the monarch. So they basically overthrew the monarchy. The Republic of Hawaii was established, and this new government petitioned the United States for annexation. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, opposed this annexation, and it's not going to happen until 1898 once we are involved in a war with Spain. So here we see a couple of acquisitions over the course of the 1800s where America stakes a claim. We're going to talk a lot more about the Philippines, and you're seeing Cuba and Puerto Rico there. So let's get into that. In the 1890s, the island of Cuba became the focus of attention for the United States. You remember from previous chapters that the United States had thought about buying Cuba from the Spanish back in the 1850s because Cuba was a very rich territory that produced a lot of sugar. In 1895, the Cubans rose up against Spanish occupation and were pushing for independence from Spain. The Spanish responded brutally by suppressing this uprising, including putting Cuban rebels and their families into concentration camps surrounded by barbed wire. Reports of the Spanish treatment of the Cubans was highly publicized by the yellow press at the time, and the newspapers were demanding a response from the United States. The United States was naturally sympathetic to the Cubans because we ourselves had become independent from an imperial power, and we didn't necessarily like the idea of European powers interfering so close to the United States. So still not really pushed to go to war in a big way. But in 1898, partly because of pressure from yellow journalists and partly just as a show of support, the U.S. sent a battleship to Cuba called the USS Maine. And it was mainly there for the purpose of evacuating Americans living in Cuba if the situation got really bad. But then on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 sailors. Immediately, the yellow press blamed the Spanish and said an underwater mine had blown up the ship. Without investigating and without really any evidence, they immediately called for war against Spain. And the call of remembering the Maine was being sounded to avenge the sailors who had died. The Spanish denied attacking the United States, and the culprit was most likely the buildup of coal dust in the engine compartments that ignited the ammunition stores of the ship. Nevertheless, the United States took a more aggressive stance toward Spain and demanded that they end their concentration camp policy and release Cuban rebels. By April of 1898, so just a couple months later, President McKinley went to Congress to deliver a message asking for a declaration of war against Spain. The purpose of the war, according to McKinley, was to help Cuban rebels achieve their freedom and end oppressive practices of the Spanish. Just to assure people that the motives of the war was not to expand imperial interest or acquire Cuba for the United States, the Teller Amendment said that the official purpose of the war was to grant the Cubans their freedom and that the United States would not annex Cuba as part of the United States. This was a way to appease the anti-imperialists who opposed the war and thought that America was just trying to take more land. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the arguments the anti-imperialists posed later in this chapter. Spain's empire had slowly been diminishing over the course of the 1516s and 1700s. But there were still some areas under possession of Spain, namely Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Before the war even broke out, U.S. ships were moved toward the Philippines under the direction of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt was acting way over his authority because the Secretary of the Navy was basically out of the office, and without asking him, Roosevelt just sent ships over to the Philippines because he anticipated war with Spain was about to start. So when the war actually happened, it was fairly easy for the United States to deploy troops to the Philippines. Admiral Dewey, along with the help of Filipino insurgents led by Emilio Aguinaldo, fought against the Spanish in the Philippines. And similar to Cuba, there was a Filipino independence movement against Spanish occupation that aided the Americans in their fight against Spain. And it was at this time that Hawaii was also annexed because war with Spain meant the United States was going to need a refueling area or staging area for further actions in the Pacific. The Spanish fleet got trounced on May 1st, and it was only a couple of months after that that Manila surrendered to American forces. So the Spanish-American War was basically fought in two places, Cuba and the Philippines. American ships were able to get to Cuba before the Spanish fleet got there, so the Spanish Navy couldn't really help the Spanish on the island of Cuba. U.S. ground forces invaded Cuba to dislodge the Spanish that were on the island. One group that was significant during this theater of the war were known as the Rough Riders. These were a volunteer cavalry group organized mainly by Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to talk more about Teddy Roosevelt later, but just so you know that when the war broke out, he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and when the war does break out, he always had this burning desire to see combat and prove himself to be a hero, so he resigned from the Navy and forms a cavalry group with old buddies from Harvard and cowboys that he had met out west. And they become collectively known as the Rough Riders and are famous for the battle at San Juan Hill, this famous charge up San Juan Hill. This has been largely mythologized because they weren't really that effective. The only reason the U.S. won at San Juan Hill was because of the Buffalo Soldiers, which were black regiments of troops that had fought against Native Americans in the West. They were the ones who really took the hill. But, it's a cool story. If the Spanish army had held out a little bit longer, the American army might have lost because of the amount of disease that was ravaging the American forces, particularly yellow fever, typhoid, and dysentery. They also had heavy wool uniforms left over from the Civil War that didn't help when it came to the tropical climate of Cuba. A lot of the supplies were also expired, like, just cans of spoiled meat that killed people because of food poisoning. But, the Spanish couldn't hold out, and by August, the Spanish had to surrender and sign an armistice, which ended the conflict. This is a map showing the encirclement of Cuba by American forces and the number of deaths in the Spanish-American War. You can see that food poisoning and disease killed way more people than any combat fatalities. Spanish and American negotiators met in Paris and agreed to the following terms. Cuba would become an independent country, Puerto Rico and Guam were going to be ceded to the United States, and the United States agreed to purchase the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. This treaty immediately triggered a debate about what to do with the Philippines. The annexation of Hawaii and the purchase of the Philippines had caused people to question whether America was supposed to be assuming the role of an imperial power by owning territories that were really far away from the mainland of the United States. America was a land of democracy and freedom, so opponents to annexing the Philippines said taking over the Philippines, which was inhabited by people who didn't want the Spanish to be there and didn't want the Americans to be there either, would contradict American ideas of freedom and self-determination. Supporters of annexation said that American civilization was the best and should be spread to all parts of the world and beyond. I mentioned the Teller Amendment earlier in this lecture because, I said that was a way of assuring the people that Cuba wasn't going to be annexed by the United States. But that didn't say anything about the rest of the possessions of the Spanish Empire. Because President McKinley was seen as an expansionist and an imperialist, this led to the formation of anti-imperialist leagues that protested against this foreign policy course for the United States. Some prominent anti-imperialists were the author Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers from the AFL, and Andrew Carnegie. Specifically related to the Philippines, the arguments for the anti-imperialists was that taking over the Philippines would violate America's principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And the more pragmatic argument was that imperialism would be too costly and that possibly overseas territories would pull the United States into military and political conflicts with other nations. On the flip side of this, pro-imperialists responded in a predictable way by saying that it was patriotic to support the United States in this endeavor and that America was undertaking a civilizing mission to improve the lives of the Filipinos, and that they would assist them until they were capable of ruling themselves. They also emphasized the potential profits that could be gained in foreign trade and in foreign markets. So despite heated protests, the Senate approved the Paris Treaty with just one vote in February of 1899. So with this, the United States officially becomes an empire. We'll get back to the Philippines in a minute, but let's talk about the status of Puerto Rico and Cuba. The Foraker Act of 1900 allowed for Puerto Rico to have a limited degree of popular government. Although they weren't given U.S. citizenship until 1917, their status today is that they are currently a self-governing commonwealth, but a lot of things are still under the control of the United States. With regards to Cuba, we've already talked about the Teller Amendment. Now Congress said they weren't going to take over Cuba. The Platt Amendment is still going to maintain some control over Cuba after it becomes an independent country. Some things included in the Platt Amendment are that the Cuban government had to agree not to take on too much debt that was beyond the resources that it had. And the U.S. was the one to determine whether they were allowed to take on more national debt. So think about how the United States became a strong country by taking on that debt back in the era of Hamilton, and how this kind of limits the economic growth of Cuba. It also gave the United States the right to intervene militarily if U.S. interests were threatened in Cuba. So basically, it gave the United States permission to invade Cuba whenever they felt like it. It also leased the area of Guantanamo Bay to the United States, which is, to this day, still a U.S. base. It is currently used to house a lot of the suspected terrorists from September 11th attacks and the War on Terror. Secretary of State John Hay called the Spanish-American War a, quote, splendid little war. It only lasted 113 days, and casualties were relatively low. So you can kind of compare this to the War of 1812 in that the big results were that it showed the United States was a nation that could go to war with other countries. Nationalism is going to experience a surge at this time, as well as America's prestige, meaning that America, the way that America looks to the rest of the world. This kind of is seen as when America transitions from being an isolationist country to being much more involved in overseas affairs. This is going to bring a lot of prosperity to American producers who are going to have markets overseas, but it's also going to make the United States have to take on commitments beyond their borders in order to defend naval and military installations outside of the United States. For example, because we have the Philippines, this is going to put us directly in the path of war with Japan in 1941. So you can kind of see both the positives and the negatives of having a bigger role in the world. The title of this slide, Little Brown Brothers, refers to the colonial governor of the Philippines, William Howard Taft, in the way he described the Filipinos. This gives you some insight into some of the imperialist attitudes about the Filipinos and their perceived ability to rule themselves, and it also gives you some insight into the inherent racism in these policies. So as the status of the Philippines was being debated among Americans, the Filipinos assumed they were going to be given independence after the Spanish-American War, similar to Cuba. However, the Filipinos were not included in peace negotiations with Spain, and there were no promises given from the United States government. In 1899, Emilio Aguinaldo, who had previously worked with the United States against the Spanish, then led an uprising against American occupation in the Philippines. This led to a deployment of U.S. troops, about 126,000 of them, to suppress the Filipino insurgents. Both sides in this conflict perpetrated atrocities against the other. Insurgents were tortured by the United States by giving them the water cure, which is basically forcing them to drink water until they died or gave up valuable information. The American forces, in order to capture the Filipinos, built concentration camps for housing them. This is almost exactly the same practice used by the Spanish in Cuba, which the United States denounced when the Spanish were doing it. In 1901, Aguinaldo was captured by American forces, but the insurgency lasted for another year. So the underlying assumptions about the Philippines was that they were incapable of ruling themselves, and they needed to be shown how to be civilized in order to be a functioning nation. However, the Filipinos never had any input on this and resented American occupation. The Philippines does finally become an independent country after 1946, but the cost of the war had taken its toll on both Americans and the Filipinos. As you can see, 4,200 Americans dead and possibly 600,000 Filipinos. We're going to transition briefly to Asia and America's increasing role in foreign affairs there. As I mentioned earlier, what the United States was doing was pretty common practice among European nations who were all competing for economic and political influence across the world. In China, each of the European powers had access to a trading zone within China called a sphere of influence. China was never directly occupied by any of these European powers, in contrast with India, which was a part of the British Empire. But China was weakened by internal warfare like the Taiping Rebellion and a weak monarchy, which allowed European countries to exert more influence. America wanted in on this, but none of the other European powers really wanted to give America trading rights. So Secretary of State John Hay basically just declared an open-door policy saying that all European powers were going to be able to trade with China along with the United States in order to allow for more competition. None of the European countries actually agreed to this initially, but over time they did, and this is going to give the United States greater influence in China. This is also going to trigger an anti-imperialist rebellion in China called the Boxer Rebellion. An organization known as the Society of the Harmonious Fists attacked foreigners and ripped up railroad lines in an attempt to expel foreign influence from China. As I said, the monarchy in China was pretty weak at the time and encouraged the rebellion, so a multinational force of European and United States troops, numbering about 18,000, crushed the rebellion. Here's a map showing the spheres of influence, and you can also see that Japan is becoming a large power as well. And in a few slides, we're going to talk about how this leads to a war between Japan and Russia over trading rights and sea navigation. Let's talk quickly about the election of 1900. So we talked about how in the election of 1896, the main issue was the silver or gold standard or the coinage of silver. In the 1900 election, the Democrats renominate William Jennings Bryan, and the issue quickly becomes imperialism and American expansion. McKinley doesn't actually do any campaigning himself. His running mate for the 1900 election is the hero from the Battle of San Juan, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt mostly did all the campaigning for McKinley and bashed William Jennings Bryan in this nationwide speaking tour. In part because America had just come out of a war successfully, and because in that period there was some economic prosperity, McKinley wins the election pretty handily. This also helped some of the rich New York bosses in their attempts to get rid of Teddy Roosevelt. For years, Roosevelt had been a reformer who had challenged wealthy industrialists in New York, so putting him in the vice presidency was a way of kind of moving him out of any meaningful role in government policy. Basically, when you're the vice president, the only thing you do is wait for the president to possibly die so you can replace him or her. And as you're going to see, that actually happens. A few months into McKinley's second term in office, he is murdered by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York. This makes Roosevelt the next president. Our analysis of Roosevelt is going to span 2 chapters, and this chapter talks a little bit about his foreign policy while he was president. Before I do that, I think we're going to talk about his background a little bit, because he's a really important figure in redefining the role of the presidency and in the reforms that he makes while he is president. Roosevelt was born to an upper-class family on Long Island, New York. Early in his life, he had asthma that prevented him from engaging in physical activities. He overcame this by rigorously exercising every day, which many people say had an impact on his dedication and perseverance and also his stubbornness. So he strove to do a lot of manly things throughout his life, and he had a lot of energy. We talked about being a Rough Rider and wanting to prove himself in battle. Prior to that, he went out west to become a cowboy after his first wife passed away, and tried to do the cowboy thing for a while. So some of the other roles he's going to assume is the chief of police of New York City, a representative for the New York government, the assistant secretary of the Navy, leader of the Rough Riders, governor of New York, all those things before becoming vice president. Teddy Roosevelt believed the president should lead boldly and come out in front of social issues. He used the phrase "speak softly and carry a big stick" to exemplify his leadership style, which often challenged the checks and balances among the 3 branches of government. He was also very well liked by the people and would use what was called the bully pulpit to pressure people into agreeing with him and following his policies. Basically means you publicize issues and getting people to follow along with them. He also felt the president should lead in the interest of the people and should be able to do anything that is not expressly forbidden by the Constitution. So, TR is a very significant figure in American history because he's going to redefine the role of the presidency in terms of what the president does and what the president is expected to do. His extension of federal power, especially when it comes to regulating the economy and regulating business, is going to be much more than any previous president. So let's talk about his foreign policy in this chapter. The big stick idea is going to be wielded on his foreign policy as well. The Spanish-American War had reinvigorated America to push for a canal that would go through the isthmus of Central America and link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Before this, ships had to go all the way around South America to get to the West Coast. So, you had the Transcontinental Railroad built in 1869, but you can carry a lot more stuff on a ship. So, some issues included in this is that other European countries had claimed the rights to build a canal zone through Panama, and parts of Panama were actually owned by the country of Colombia. So the Hay-Paunchefort Treaty, I'm not pronouncing that right, but who cares, was negotiated between European powers that gave the United States permission to build a canal through this area, gave them the right to fortify it militarily. So that is, that gets the Europeans out of the way. The only thing standing in the way next was Colombia, whose government rejected the American offer to buy the Canal Zone and offer them annuity payments for control of it. So the Roosevelt administration responds by helping incite a rebellion among Panamanian nationalists who wanted to become their own independent country in 1901. The American Navy then blocked Colombian ships from going to the Isthmus to quell the rebellion, and the Americans recognized the new Panamanian government as the legitimate government. The new Panamanian government then signs a treaty with the United States that ceded control of the Canal Zone to them. This is going to make Roosevelt very unpopular in Central and South America for meddling in the affairs of foreign countries, but Roosevelt felt he was doing what he thought was best for the United States. You're also going to see in this, this picture here that Roosevelt had commissioned the building of what was called the Great White Fleet, which basically was a series of new, modern, impressive ships that then did basically a worldwide tour to kind of show off the military might of the United States. This brings us to a larger part of Roosevelt's foreign policy with regards to the United States intervention in Central and South America. You remember the Monroe Doctrine from 1823 that kind of said to keep Europe out of American affairs by saying America would take care of American affairs. The result is that it makes America a more isolationist country and we focus on our own development. So the corollary is kind of like an add-on, and Roosevelt kind of takes the Monroe Doctrine and just adds a little bit to it. Basically, he said that the United States should be allowed to practice preventive intervention, which means that if American interests are threatened in Central and South America, the United States has a right to intervene, possibly with the military. This is tested in 1905 when the United States took over collecting tariffs in the Dominican Republic. Between 1905 and 1916, Teddy Roosevelt and subsequent presidents are going to exert a lot of influence in the Caribbean and Central America. You can see here, this shows a map that shows American interventions in the Caribbean and Central America. You see that in several places, U.S. troops were deployed to prop up a government that was in danger of being overthrown, like in Haiti or Nicaragua or Guatemala. If we want to understand relations with Central America and Caribbean countries today, it's useful to know our history and the way America is seen by these countries. Platism, which is a reference to the Platt Amendment, is still a derogatory term in Cuba, and our relations with Mexico today, which haven't been very good, are not only the product of the Mexican-American War, but also in the military interventions the United States undertook in 1916 to try to replace the government of Mexico and in pursuing Pancho Villa. Lastly, let's talk about Roosevelt and his role in Asian affairs. In 1905, Japan went to war against Russia for control over international waters and the Korean Peninsula. Japan had been expanding and modernizing over the course of the 1800s, and the resulting Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan successfully defeats Russia, comes as a complete surprise to European powers. It's the first time that an Asian country in modern times defeats a European country through military engagement. So Roosevelt serves as a mediator between the two powers in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1905, and ultimately wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, which many people find ironic because of his foreign policy. This agreement ends up leading to a wave of Japanese immigration to California, and they are met with, you guessed it, discriminatory practices. As a result of this incoming immigration, the school board of San Francisco orders the segregation of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean students into a special school, which insults the government of Japan. There's even talk of war between Japan and the United States over this. So the Gentleman's Agreement is reached between Roosevelt and the government of Japan, where California repeals the school order to segregate, but Japan would also in turn agree to stop sending immigrants to the United States. And subsequently, the Root-Takahira Agreement was an agreement between Japan and the United States that would acknowledge each side's territorial claims in the Pacific, which paves the way for more open-door trading with China. So, there's this agreement where Japan is going to stop immigration and the United States isn't going to discriminate against the Japanese that are there. But looking ahead, we are going to see this tension between the United States and Japan eventually break out into war over control of Pacific affairs. So in closing, here is a map of Africa and Asia and the different possessions that European powers have. The United States is now an imperialist nation, and we have economic and political interests that lay outside of our borders. It's hard to imagine the United States not being in this role, so it's important to understand where that role really started to take shape. World War I and World War II are going to dramatically redefine America's role in the world and America's position, but these are just some of the first steps. Here's the timeline. Thanks for listening.